Okay, so Tim, Mr. Smitty, the first question came from Mark White regarding EVs, and he wanted to know, would it drastically reduce gasoline, and what are some of the tax replacements that are going to be set in place to help convince the Texas legislature to pass EV-friendly policies?
So we don't know yet how much it would affect gasoline production and consumption. If the world electrifies, certainly that's going to have a significant impact on the consumption of fossil fuels. And when you look at fossil fuels, while we think of vehicles as being large consumers of that, the other big consumers of fossil fuels are the electric utility industry, and as battery technology changes, that will also reduce the demand for natural gas, and shipping and ships and boats and barges and so forth, and trains. Those technologies are lagging behind, but are also moving very rapidly toward electrification. And the last big sectors where we use petroleum products sectors are in plastic production and fertilizer production. As you know, there are a lot of people working to try and end plastic pollution. So there will be an impact, and we'll really start to see that accelerating probably in the middle of the next decade as a demand suppressor. And we've already talked about the taxes, so let's go on to the next question.
All right, thank you, Mark, again for that question. The next question comes from Philip Timmons. He wants to know if you have any more information about electric roadways.
Not off the top of my head, and I had a computer crash and literally lost my memory. But there are a number of studies out there that do look at those, and particularly some of the engineering journals and Clean Technia and other consumer electric vehicle publications have written on this pretty extensively.
Okay. With concerning battery costs, Jennifer Lane asked, what can be done about reducing battery costs for the greater community?
I'm sorry, say that again, please. Oh.
Jennifer asked, what can be done about reducing battery costs for the greater community?
Yeah, I actually said that the batteries cost about the same amount as a solar array.
And so that, yeah, to spin off that question, in comparison to the solar arrays, she wants to know how that can be mass produced.
It's just outside. It's outside the feasible.
Well, it is at the moment, but there's something that many of you certainly follow more than I, called Moore's Law, which basically has predicted correctly in the computer world that technology changes at a rate that is far beyond proportional. And that's what's happening with batteries, that the cost of batteries are dropping and faster than the cost of solar, because solar is largely driven today, not by the cost of the cells, but by the cost of the racking and installation and sales, which are more or less fixed costs at this point. That's what's going to happen with batteries. But the other interesting thing that's going to happen is, in the very near future, and certainly today for commercial electric utilities and big institutions, you can take used electric vehicle batteries and then put them on the wall at your home, store your solar, and then use it as an energy source for your home. And when my battery crapped out, I did not do that for two reasons. One, the people who advised me on that said, okay, your battery is crapped out. This is not going to work. You know, you could spend a lot of money trying to fix it, but don't try. And the technology, the computer infrastructure interfaces are not yet ready to do that. But if you've got a lot of capital like utilities and want to start to experiment with it, they can custom make it. And the technology as this new generation of GM and Volkswagen Ford and Renault Nissan batteries, and the LGs and the Panasonics become that are used in Teslas are becoming more standardized, then there are fewer interfaces and control modules to try and link in. The Volt battery was sort of archaic at this point. Nobody's investing in that interface for that particular product. So that'll end up hanging on our walls, and that'll really.
Given that COVID-19 has shown us all that we can work from home, Rosa would like to know, do you see a further decline in commuting distances and thus decline in charging at workplaces?
Yes. The numbers are pretty interesting. Of course, depends on what you do and where you are, but in Travis County, where I live, the county actually did a study on employee effectiveness. And there are lots of methodological problems I have with the study, but the answer was that for 76% of the people who worked for the county did not have to return to an office. In fact, their productivity went up when working from home. And and they looked at the cost of upgrading their computer infrastructure and allowing more people to work from home versus building the 3 new office buildings they had scheduled. And they said, you know, it's a fraction of the cost to allow our employees to work at home, significantly less congestion, significantly less pollution, and we can defer or avoid having to build new office structures for our employees. And the employees' satisfaction was significantly higher. And because they weren't having to spend all those hours a year driving back and forth to downtown or to the other county centers. So I suspect we'll see a lot of that. Maybe as the numbers I've been reading are 16 to as high as 30% of employees will probably never go back to work in an office structure.
Okay, Jim Cochran would like to know, would purchasing a car charger for a single family household on regarding to your slow versus fast charging chart you referenced, would the at-home car charger be faster than a regular 120 volt charge?
Oh yeah, and there are now new Chinese-made aftermarket car chargers. I think the last 220 I bought was $127 plus shipping, and it seems to work just fine. And you can plug them into dryer outlets, or relatively inexpensively, if your dryer is powered by gas as opposed to electricity, pirate the electricity to from your dryer into your garage and plug the 220s in or two there. And I've done that now twice here and at a house we're rehabbing up in north of Austin, and you know, it's piece of cake stuff. It works. It's easy, it's cheap, and with the relatively inexpensive chargers, I'm able to recharge in 3 hours or less.
Okay. Eugenia assumes that what you showed regarding BEVs is for operation and maintenance only. Her question is, how would one compare total cost of ownership of BEVs to ICEVs, and how do they compare with or without tax breaks?
So there is a really good issue in the October 2020 Consumer Reports that gives you that information. And total cost of ownership in the chart that I showed you was the cost of operations and fueling and maintenance, and not the cost. But when you typically look at lifetime costs for the sort of moderate or low income electric vehicles, it is cheaper over the lifetime without a doubt. We start
So
to get,
have they reached parity with IC EVs then when they're included, the taxes?
oh yeah, but what you don't see is the sticker price parity, and that's what you're going to see sometime in the middle of this decade.
Okay. Melon would like to know, how can we overcome resistance from traditional car dealerships networks that rely heavily on service maintenance for profit?
That's a really big question. And one of the issues that TechCetra is going to face, and I would enjoin you, would ask that you all be part of this debate, is whether or not we as an organization and the state ought to participate in the debate over direct sales. Tesla, Rivian, Nikolai, Workhorse, which are primarily truck manufacturers, the last of those, and several of the new EV manufacturers are for sedans and SUVs are all going to go to direct sales. It's currently illegal to do that, and there are legal impediments to doing that in Texas. I won't say it's exactly illegal. And there's tremendous resistance from the dealers. And then they create their own maintenance networks. So you avoid that sales impediment. You do it online. I bought my last 2 cars entirely online, and then went in and had to hand somebody my spec sheet, who then tried to upgrade me to an SUV that I didn't want. So there's tremendous resistance. And so that's going to be a big debate. By giving incentives to the dealers, one of my ideas is just to buy off resistance by giving a portion of that incentive to the dealer. My friends who have worked for dealerships say you can't give them enough money to really overcome the cost differential out of a $2,500 incentive. They make a lot more money on an ICE than $2,500. So you can give the whole 2,500 state incentive, it wouldn't matter. So I don't know how we're going to get over it.
Bob would like to know, what do you think the projection of DC versus AC conversion would be in according to advancement?
I don't know the answer to that. I just don't know.
Yeah. And then
Joella, before you go on, this is Rosa. Does anybody else in the audience have any information on that question?
This is Randy Boys. Just an observation, not necessarily on the total DC versus AC issue, but keep in mind that the DC fast chargers only need to be used for, a truck that's barreling down the highway and needs to go its next 400 miles, or for you on those couple of occasions a year when you're headed across country. Most of us only drive, 35, 40 miles a day on average. That's an easy charge. It's a mindset change to realize, unlike the early days of EVs where every time you went out, it was like, where's my charger? That's not the way that they're going to be with 300-mile batteries in them that you just, top off every now and then when you need to. So I see there being a lot of need for AC charging, and I think a lot more of it out and around will be at the 220, 208, 240 level, just because that's so much more convenient. You just unless you're in your garage, you really can't be at one of those 120s long enough to do anything. So just some facts in the sphere.
Yeah, and to go to Randy's point, I think one of the things, and thank you for being on the call, Randy. One of the things we see is that as range goes up, we're now in the 250 sort of a standard new cars on the market. We're get up into 3 and 4s. And technologically, it's possible we might actually have enough energy in our vehicles to get from Dallas to El Paso in the not too distant future as battery technology and battery density improves. But at some point, if you're going across country, you are going to have to charge. And that's where the fast chargers, and for the heavy duty trucks, the DC may be by far the more efficient. So, time will tell. Technology will tell.
Okay, well, I don't see any more direct questions. So to the audience who's listening, if you want to unmute and ask your questions now, the floor is open.
I do want to bring everyone's attention to the chat, and that there's some great observations and references to like dockets before the PUC on EV. There was actually a question about to Smitty in regards to upcoming EV legislation. What do you think is going to be happening in the next Texas legislature? Is there any plans, or what do you think is going forward there?
As many of you know, I've been lobbying for 40 years, and this is going to be the weirdest session I've ever been through, and I have been through some very weird sessions. Currently, the plan is for the legislatures to do as little as possible during this session because of COVID. They will probably meet and pass the rules, elect a new speaker on the House side, re-elect the lieutenant governor as presiding officer, and go home, and may end up doing most of the committee hearings by via Zoom or WebEx, whatever they use over there. And then come back and do the balance of the legislation that would normally be done in special sessions. They will have to pass a budget and a tax bill. Those are the must-pass bills in any given session, and appoint committees. What we are intending to do is to treat this session as an educational session, and to put out this omnibus bill as a tool for education, and then figure it out after that, see what happens, whether we can get this added to the call for one or more special sessions. I think the PUC may request, the chairwoman may request the legislature examine some EV related issues, and there may be some opportunities to do some of the inspection kinds of things and some of the fuel or the tax related kinds of things as amendments to other bills that have to pass. So we're looking at our plan A, plan B, plan C. I think we're actually down to a plan E right now. And so time will tell where we're going to go, but we don't know. Normally we'd have our bills, would have sponsors, would have our bills being drafted. We'd know how, what the plan was going to be and tell you who to go see in these meetings. And I will say this as an opportunity, Michael, I'll work with you on this, is that in November, typically, after we know the results of the elections, TxEtra has a membership meeting to discuss upcoming legislation. And we both ask the people in attendance and this will be a Zoom meeting, what their thoughts are on a couple key policy questions. The taxes will probably be one. Another will be direct sales, whether we need to advocate for that or avoid that fight. Then other part of that is to really begin to come up with coalitions around which we can build legislative strategy. And depending on the progress of COVID, that might be asking your legislator to go for a ride either in your car or virtually via Zoom with having somebody sit in the back seat of your car and while you talk about your car, but also talking about the issues that are going to be in the legislation and why they need to be involved. So
Yeah,
you
if you can advise us when that meeting is, and we'll post it to our members and to the local EV clubs. I know that you'll be sharing it. I think that's fantastic. Actually, there were a couple of questions trying to have you answer what your legislative actions might be coming up for TechCetra. And also about the advocacy. There's a large Tesla owners group here. And, you know, they were involved in legislative sessions last year in regards to EV sales and everything like that. I do think with Tesla going to Austin for their big, manufacturing facility there, and you just now mentioned that they're going to have a battery facility there as well. I mean, that's somewhat of a motivator there for Texas to get off the seat.
And I think that I can't overstate the impact of the Tesla decision, because suddenly this isn't just a bunch of enviro wackos or high-tech nerds who think EVs are cool. This is business, big business, and it's not just Tesla. Peterbilt is up in your part of the world in Denton.
Yeah.
And we were making a presentation in front of a legislative committee last February, I think it was January, February. And the second witness we pulled up was from Peterbilt talking about the jobs that they currently have in their electric vehicle manufacturing facilities, but also talking about those that they expected. And it turned out that two of the members of the legislature had relatives working in the electric vehicle plant at Peterbilt, either doing engineering or being a manufacturing lead on the floor. And so people who were very conservative Republicans began to be very interested in advocating for EVs because they see this as business. So down in San Antonio, we have the Navistar plant, which manufactures medium-duty truck school buses. Houston, the Toshiba Heavy Industries operation manufactures transmissions and motors. And so there's a tremendous economic system in place. There are roughly about 17,000 jobs that we are currently in Texas, with an addition of another 5,000 directly at the Tesla plant. Typically, the spin-off is about 2.13, so we're really talking about somewhere north of 10 or 15,000 people working in manufacturing electric vehicle parts and components to feed that Tesla plant. How many of them will be in Texas is unknown at this point, but that's generally what the projection is. So it's becoming a big manufacturing component of our state, and it pays better than average.
It's kind of like the elephant in the room, right? Or say the long-haired steer, longhorn steer.
Yeah.
Anyway, there's a couple interesting questions regarding the fees associated with vehicles now. And so the question I have is, shouldn't people be trying to eliminate fees for going electric instead of developing fees to achieve government or advocate group policy aims? So what is the public's interest in whether the fee structure going forward with electric vehicles?
If you use the roads, you ought to pay for them. And we all will use the roads, and in so doing, damage the roads and the infrastructure. That's the straight answer. From a policy perspective, if we're seen as willing to pay our fair share of the expenses of the highway system, as opposed to opposing it, then we're seen as responsible people who are willing to, as opposed to trying to get a special deal or yet another government incentive. And from a political, as a political practitioner, I have counseled my membership that being willing to pay your fair share is absolutely the right way to go into a legislative session, and will get you accepted as opposed to suppressed.
So Susan Alvarez asked a number of great questions, and one of them was in regards to on EV chargers. There's been discussion about them becoming retail electric providers. What is Texetra's position on that?
We don't think they are, and it's a great question. For those of you who may not know why this is an issue, when we deregulated in 2001, the electric generation, the electric system was divided into three parts: companies that generate the electricity, companies that sell the electricity, or retail electric providers, and then a third component is the companies that transmit and distribute it. And under that statute, anyone who sells electricity at retail is considered a retail electric provider and needs to register. And with registration comes a significant amount of appropriate regulatory oversight and costs. And the costs are very high. And it should be, to provide fly-by-night companies going bankrupt and leaving people in the dark. However, 35 other states have looked at this issue, and we agree with this position that resale of electricity for charging is not the same as for providing energy in your home or at your business. That electric vehicle charging is an end use, like operating your dryer or your refrigerator or your air conditioner. And there is a system in, there's a similar system called a competitive electric service that is only lightly regulated and requires registration as opposed to full regulation. We think that this electric vehicle charging is that kind of an animal as opposed to a retail electric provider. And we have a lot of support for that. In our membership, or our policy group that meets monthly, of the 20 odd people who participated in that particular portion of the discussion, it was 24. I think there were 3 or 4 members of our organization in recent comments at the PUC 6 that thought it ought to be regulated. And most of those thought it ought to be differently regulated than what we would require for a full-blown retail electric provider.
Okay, we have some more. From Bill Byram, he's saying several years ago there was some talk about replaceable standardized batteries, which would allow large trucks and even cars to quickly swap out the battery to achieve unlimited range. Are you aware of that technology and any companies that are moving forward on that? He references possibly there's an Israeli company that's doing some work there. Do you know about that?
Yeah, That's certainly something that's been discussed since the 90s, and there are companies who are looking at that technology. One of the things that is interesting is that the big manufacturing companies are going toward a standardized battery casing and so forth. And there's some speculation in the industry that this will become a replaceable or interchangeable battery, much like we take the batteries out of a flashlight and put new ones in. And so that may be coming down the line. The technological hurdles for doing that and the cost of that infrastructure are high at this point. And so if that happens, my sense is it will be for interstate trucking or something like that, where you can have you can afford the infrastructure and not necessarily for light duty or medium duty vehicles. But it's certainly something watching, and there are technological evolutions that may make it more and more likely that could happen.
I'm going to go back to a question talking about the Tesla facility in Austin again. Can you give us some comments on what's happening there and what you see the projections to be?
So it's moving at warp speed. One of the commenters in the newspaper the other day said this is moving at ludicrous speed. They are talking.
For all those Tesla owners, they know what that means.
It isn't plaid speed, that I can tell you. But they are doing site preparation right now and beginning to develop it looks like some of the foundational kinds of pieces are going in. They're talking about being operational by next April, which is stunning and unbelievable to me. But a lot of what Musk has said over the years was unbelievable, and then he went out and did it. So you can see, as I was mentioning before, most of you got on the phone Saturday or Friday afternoon, after it was approved on a Thursday, you could see clouds of dust and massive lights and cranes going up at the site. You go out there now and there's little traffic jams of trucks moving in and out of the site. And you see these massive cranes beginning to excavate to put in foundations and so forth. They are talking, in addition to building a battery plant out there, we also expect that there will be a recycling plant potentially here in Texas, because it not only would be able to provide them with feedstock, but also take the precious metals and sell them off to the chip manufacturers here in the Central Texas Silicon Valley. The other thing that we're beginning to see is large tracts of property being gobbled up or under exploratory contract for other subsidiary manufacturers, whether it's seats or computer chips or other components of a vehicle that Tesla doesn't make. So we'll see what happens, but it looks to me like we're going to have a huge boom along the 130 corridor that runs, tollway corridor that runs to the east of Austin, and is our poorest part of town. And I suspect there'll be a tremendous economic boom out there as well. The other thing that Tesla did, which I think is really important, is they made substantial commitments to about training and hiring low-income employees in the community in which they're residing. They made big payments toward the local school system in lieu of taxes, but also to set up a training center for kids coming out to go into the electric vehicle manufacturing world. And they also made big equity commitments to the city and have agreed to create a massive park along the river there that will be publicly accessible. So we're glad they're here. I wish they'd paid more money in terms of their minimum starting wage, but we can't have everything.
I have an interesting observation from Jennifer Lane, and what she says is part of what has been driving the move to electric vehicles has been the number of cars on the road. But now that there are fewer cars on the road because of the of COVID, if this remains the case, what does that do for the projections?
It's a really good question, and the European experience is illustrative, I think, here in that although as a result of COVID, their car sales plummeted, electric vehicles, raw numbers and as a percentage, increased during the pandemic, indicating to a number of observers that the tide has turned, and when people are replacing their cars, they're doing so with electric vehicles. And some are taking advantage of lowered prices to buy a car that they were postponing or thinking about anyway. So who knows? I've been sort of shopping for a new electric vehicle, and I will tell you those prices are for many products are not lower. This, however, as I understand it, is a great time to go buy a Chevrolet Bolt with a B, because that they're going to have a new model out in 2021, and they're giving them away.
There is a comment here is kind of a question as well. It's Toyota has been pushing fuel cells for over 10 years. Do you think fuel cells have a future in regards to transportation, and where would that be? Will they be a hybrid solution with electric vehicles? Anyway, I'll throw that out.
Yes, yes. The answer is I do think they will have a future. They will probably largely be used in the heavy-duty trucking world. One of the knocks against batteries and heavy-duty trucking is they add weight and reduce payload. And if you use a hydrogen fuel cell, hydrogen being lighter than air, can actually reduce the weight of the engine and component of the vehicle. But creating a hydrogen infrastructure is very expensive. There are parts of the country where there is already a substantial hydrogen infrastructure. Think the Port of Houston and all the refineries, Corpus Christi, Port Arthur, etc. When they pipe hydrogen underground routinely for a variety of different purposes. And so ports, seaports in particular, may be a place where that happens. And the fuel cell technology is inherently a hybrid technology that utilizes electric drive. So I think there will be a place for that. Is it going to be ripe for a light duty vehicle? I don't think so. It's just the cost of hydrogen infrastructure is just too high. Cost of the reformers that would be required to be installed to crack water into hydrogen and oxygen are too high for the average consumer, especially when you've got ready electric power. So I think that's not going to happen.
There's been a number of comments dealing with car inspections. You know, will electric vehicles require them versus the ICE vehicles? Maintenance is another issue. I mean, I know that you presented some facts on the cost of maintenance. Another question dealt with, well, what about the overall expense, the life cycle cost of an electric vehicle versus an ICE vehicle? So I guess it's a multitask question there.
So to go to the easy one, the data is incomplete right now. because electric vehicles are so new, but the data tends to show that the overall life cycle cost, the higher purchase price minus the cost of fuel and maintenance, is dramatically, is significantly lower. It is particularly lower for the medium duty delivery vans, and for the drayage truck, not so yet for the heavy duty vehicles, but will be soon. In terms of maintenance costs, the sort of fact that kind of really proves the point is there are 1/10 as many moving parts in an electric vehicle, and they are not stressed by having thousands of explosions that are occurring internally all of the time. They're literally trying to blow apart
Going down the road.
the engine compartment. So, the maintenance costs are significantly less. And that's certainly been my experience. Up until the time I had to replace the battery due to an unfortunate incident with reprogramming it by the dealership, my cost of ownership on my Volt after 150,000 miles was right on the numbers, right at 1/3 of the cost of maintaining an internal combustion engine of the same era. And the big difference was no oil changes and none of the routine kinds of costs for tune-ups and all of the other kinds of things we typically spend money on periodically on an internal combustion engine. My first tune-up was required for my Chevrolet Volt at 150,000 miles. I have a hybrid Highlander of about the same era, and you have to do that roughly 5 times in that same period of time. So the costs are just dramatically lessened.
We have a great question from Rosa, and she's asking, what are your thoughts on how to bring into the low-income communities their ability to participate in the benefits of electric vehicles?
That's a great question, Rosa. Thank you for that question. It's a classic chicken and egg situation. You need to get chargers into the communities for people who think they can operate and own an electric vehicle. That both means landlords have to participate, but you also have to get public charging facilities out as well. For low-income people, the average low-income family nationally, not in Texas, but I suspect it's worse in Texas, spends roughly 30% of their income on transportation-related costs. Typically, low-income people have to drive farther. They're not urban folk anymore. Our low-income population now is suburban and rural. And they often have to, because people work more than one job in that economic strata, drive to 2 jobs in cars that are less fuel efficient and break down more often. And they have significantly higher costs of credit. Most of us who have established good credit over the years are paying 2-3% when we go buy a new car. They are in the 14% range, 12 to 14% range with impaired credit. So all those costs add up. Now for the average family, it's about 13%. So in terms of overall transportation costs. So it's a big chunk. And then if you are able to cut the cost of ownership to 1/3, that's a big help. And then typically at this point, although I don't think it's going to remain that way for long, the cost of a used electric vehicle is about 20 to 25% less than the cost of a similar sedan. And that's largely because people have concerns about the batteries and the new technology not being as easy to maintain. So it's cheaper to buy, cheaper to own, cheaper to fuel, and more reliable. Sounds like a winning plan to me if we can get the chargers out in those communities.
So if you're a member of the low income community and you had the opportunity to purchase a EV, you wouldn't necessarily go buy a new one. What's the used EV market like for that community? I mean, as far as affordability and just, resources out there.
That's a big issue. And one of the emerging planks within NTREG, et cetera, is the whole examining equity issues and trying to figure out solutions to that problem. So there are a number of groups. EV Noir is a minority-run group, really concentrating largely on the African American population, getting them involved in electric vehicle ownership. There are similar Hispanic groups, particularly on the West Coast. They're targeting their populations with appropriate messengers. There are a variety of different ways that are being explored to familiarize people with the costs of the values of an electric vehicle. So there are programs that are designed out there to help get people in driving rides, to have the Ubers and Lyfts that particularly serve low-income people have electric vehicles, to be able to have the nonprofit organizations that serve them use electric vehicles. All of these are things that are underway to familiarize low-income people with the technologies and the values. And one of my favorite strategies is a strategy where a couple of the manufacturers are actually targeting ministers and providing special financing packages for the ministers. I had a friend when I was growing up that sold Cadillacs, and he said the best way to get low-income folks into a Cadillac is to have their minister drive it. So they were cutting great deals to ministers on Cadillacs to build their market.
So, all of our major metropolitan areas have our areas of low income, and we're trying to get them into the modern, environment as well. And so Susan brings to our attention, Susan Alvarez, who's with the city of Dallas, she mentions that there is a program called On the Road Lending, and they're currently buying off-lease Toyotas and working with lower income families toward purchase of lower emission hybrids and EVs. So it's great to know that there's those types of programs out there, and we need to be, advocating for more and more of those so that, in the end, everyone can benefit from the use and ownership of electric vehicles going forward.
And just to touch on that particular organization, the woman who runs that is an extremely talented and smart woman who comes from an investment banking background and really focuses on trying to reduce the delta between the high cost of financing in the low that is often provided to the low income communities as their only option, with significantly lower costs of financing for those that have gone through her credit counseling program and are working poor. It's a great program, and I urge you all to pay some attention to them. And if you are in a position financially to either support them through donations or to park some capital with them, they're good people and they've got a really great track record.
I raise another question in regards to the low-income community, and is that in Texas, do you have any examples where there might be like a model that's either starting, can be improved upon, that's working with the low-income community in regards to electric vehicles?
Not yet, but I tell you, we've got programs in development stages in Austin, San Antonio, Houston, and would really like to work with folks in the Dallas-Fort Worth area to do that. Lori Clark at the North Central Texas Council of Governments is someone who is deeply involved in all that. And for those of you in the Dallas-Fort Worth area, if you can work with Lori on this, she's the person who's got all the connections, and we all rely upon to put us in contact with the best programs, et cetera.
Yeah, Lori and the COG up here, we depend on them a lot. They're a good friend for NTREG. And we appreciate all the work they do for all the communities that are involved in the COG up here.
Let me just simply say, that is the best council of governments in the state of Texas, and wins and deserves national awards for their leadership, particularly on environmental issues. And you're very lucky to have them and their staff.
So I'm going to go back to a series of questions that some of it has been answered, but some of it has not. And it's from James Orenstein. Way back in the beginning, he had like 4 questions. And so, and it deals with, who pays for electric vehicle charging, right? So his first question was, as a matter of policy, which entity or entities should be permitted to own or operate an electric vehicle charging station in the Texas competitive electric market? Is it a different ownership structure appropriate for service areas, not open to retail competition?
I'm sorry to interrupt, but those are actually the questions that the Texas PUC asked, and I was asking if Smitty wanted to comment on Texetra.
Oh, I apologize. I didn't go up to the top of your question there. I just saw the.
So Texetra filed a response to those, and I don't know if Smitty wanted to go into that level of detail. But.
So I'll just hit the detail. There have been 2 series of questions that have been asked by the Public Utilities Commission. I think there were a total of 13 questions, or maybe 10 questions with a total of 13 subparts when you look at all of them. So the answer is, yeah, there's clearly going to be a different model of ownership that should be permitted for folks like Denton that they're lucky enough to have a municipal electric utility, and they aren't open to retail competition. So the utility there, we believe, ought to be able to choose to sell electricity, sell charging services should they want to do that, or we believe that they should be allowed to bring in contractors after an appropriate bidding process to operate those charging stations. That's what happens in Austin and San Antonio. And I think there are 53 municipal utilities, and we haven't done an analysis of that, and a similar number of electric co-ops. And each of those ought to have a different model, have slightly different models for doing the same thing.
Okay. James, do you want to ask your questions or see any of the ones you particularly want Smitty to answer?
No, whatever he wants to say is fine.
Okay.
So I've switched off. Are there other questions? I don't have my chat open.
Yeah, I know, that's okay.
Michael, maybe we should open it up to anybody who submitted a question on the chat and
Yeah, if I
believes
didn't
they
get
haven't been answered.
That's a great, let's do that, Rosa. Anyone who, I try to get all the questions. I may have missed 1 or 2. If you feel like you weren't addressed, I apologize. But the thing is it's open now. If you want to ask your questions to Smitty. We have 5 or 6 minutes left, but we can go over depending on, the number of questions we have. Smitty, you've done a great job. Thank you so much for coming up and doing this for us.
I really appreciate it.
Yeah.
Appreciate the opportunity.
So I open it up to the floor as if anyone wants to ask Smitty a question, please feel free.
Hi, this is Eugenia. Can you hear me okay? I have a question about battery life and the secondhand market. I've heard that one of the big concerns of the secondhand market is you're going to buy a used electric vehicle, is the battery about to go out. So I'm wondering with the technologies, is battery life also expected to be extended in addition to the cost per kilowatt hour going down?
Yeah, that's a really good question, and there are several different parts to it. One of the concerns about the used electric vehicle market is the, am I getting a vehicle that somebody's selling because the battery's bad or fixing to go bad? And there are ways to test the battery technologies, and if you're that depend on the vehicle. Some, like Leafs, as I understand it, you can actually open a screen on the car. It pops up the battery health, as it were. Others, like the GM products, are much more opaque, and you have to plug it into the little onboard monitor. And you can then get a commercial program that will tell you the health of the battery. I recently, as I mentioned, bought a hybrid Toyota more than a year ago now. But when I was calling around to choose between the many companies that are offering lemon busters or whatever the people are that come out and do used car assessments, I was very pleased that 3 out of the 5 I called to get an estimate or availability offered that they had now technologies to help check the health of the battery in the hybrid, or also electric vehicles. So that aftermarket service is now beginning to catch up to that. And then, as I mentioned, when I replaced the Volt battery, I bought a remanufactured battery rather than a new one because the cost was about half. And the remanufacturer offered an upgraded battery at the time, and it increased the range and had a number of the initial control problems or controller problems with the Volt battery eliminated because they were using newer technologies that had figured out a way to avoid that. So I think the remanufactured battery market will lead to a significant improvement in technology. And lastly, I had a meeting one day with a car dealer who runs a large chain of used car shops, and amongst the options they offer are extended warranties. And this was, to me, a really telling point. So I said, one of the barriers we have to selling used EVs is the fact that there's not an extended warranty available. He called me back about a week later and he says, after doing research, I will absolutely warranty the battery on any electric vehicle made with the exception of 2, and I won't name them, but because, and they were both air-cooled batteries, that may give you a clue, because of reliability. Watch that, by the way, if you're thinking about a used EV, because of the reliability exceeds those of an internal combustion engine. And so, I figured if the warranty companies, the extended warranty companies, are willing to write a used car extended warranty for cost less than that of an internal combustion engine, that tells me the data is rich and that EVs win this game as well.
Are there any other questions? Well, Smitty, I guess we can close her down. We're a little early.
All right. Well, let me share one more pitch with you, if I might.
Okay.
My T-shirt says organize, And it's a message I typically want to share, is that the only way we win these battles, the only way we really overcame the resistance of the coal companies, was through organizations, through groups like yourselves, who came together and worked their legislators and made policy happen. And I frequently tell the story of a couple women in the Dallas area, many of whom you know, Molly Rook, Rita Beving, who took on the Renewable Energy Challenge and went and talked to their churches, to the environmental communities, to the faith communities, to the investor communities, and generated more letters to their legislators than any other issue except teacher pay raise in the 2001 legislative session.
Wow.
That's what win these battles. Ralph Nader, who I used to work in association with, had a saying that he stole from somebody else, I'm sure, which is the only thing that ever beats organized money is organized people. And you are empowered to be organized people to make the sort of social transition we're going to need to be able to reduce the impact of our transportation section on the climate. It is your efforts that have won this battle over renewables and many others in my 40-year career. And it is simply power of people, power of contacting your legislators, of giving them a vision of a better way and saying, this is going to be a win-win-win for the state of Texas. It's going to be cheaper for consumers, it's going to be good for business, and it's also going to help the environment. And particularly for the more conservative members of the legislature, better for business is the key message that you really need to be sharing with us. So we'll be in contact with you as we know more about what this session is going to look like and what our big legislative pushes are going to be. But together we can make these transitions happen like we have so often. I have relied upon your organization and called on the folks in the North Texas Renewable Energy Group in the past. You've delivered, and this is one of those battles we can't afford to lose, the battle over our climate. And together we can put together the policies they're going to need to transition our transportation infrastructure and to reduce the extraordinary amount of pollution that comes from our tailpipes and our refineries and our oil and gas production. We can do this, but time after time, we have stood up and said, it's time for change. And this is one of those moments. Let's do it. Let's create an evolution here in Texas in the way we transport ourselves. Thanks for taking the time on a Saturday morning to spend time with me. I appreciate it.
Thank you.
Smitty,
And I'll
this is
turn it over to
Rosa.
Rosa. She
I'm
can
sorry.
close our meeting out.
Thank you very much for joining us today. And you have still held the crowd, as about 5 minutes ago or so, we still had 34 people on the call listening. So you kept their attention. Thank you. And I want to have everybody give Smitty a big round of applause. Thank you. For next month, we're going to continue the EV trend that we're on. Our next meeting is November 14th, Saturday, which is the second Saturday of the month. And we have Larry Brassfield and Nate, I hope I'm pronouncing this right, Baguio from Lion Energy Company out of Canada. And they will be speaking on light utility EV vehicles.
Thank you, Rosa. As always, you're just phenomenal as far as our leadership here with NTREG, and we thank you for everything that you do. I want to remind everyone that you can save all the chat questions and the links and everything if you go down to the lower right corner with the 3 dots and click on that and save the chat, and it'll just go into a text file, and you can go back and enjoy or continue your research in regards to this topic. Again, Smitty, thank you very much.
Yes, and thank you. We look forward to working with you. And thank everybody who participated.